Farah Carter, at 27, lived a life suspended between the clouds, yet her feet had never truly touched the ground of real love. As a flight attendant, she spent most of her time soaring through foreign skies, where time slipped by like an endless dream without a landing point. She grew up in a small apartment in New York, where money was always tight. Since childhood, Farah had fantasized about a fairy tale love, a man who would look at her with burning intensity, sweep her into his arms, and ask her to marry him with his whole heart. But life had carved a different path for her. Instead of chasing romantic dreams, Farah had fought her way through school and carved out a career in the skies. She loved the freedom of flying, the endless destinations, but her heart remained empty. In the solitude of lavish hotel rooms, she realized that no matter how many miles she traveled, she had never truly belonged to anyone. Farah carried a secret no one knew. She was still a virgin, not because she lacked the opportunity, but because she had never found someone who made her feel ready. It was a hidden flame, something she kept locked away, waiting for someone special enough to ignite it. On a crisp spring morning, as sunlight poured through the airport windows at JFK, Farah rolled her suitcase toward her flight to Paris. She had no idea that within hours her life would change forever. Inside the business class cabin of the New York to Paris flight, Farah Carter moved gracefully between the rows of seats, her posture poised and professional. Her navy blue uniform hugged her frame, and her dark hair was neatly twisted into a flawless bun. Sharp brown eyes scanned the passengers as she offered polite smiles, ones she had practiced 1,000 times before. The cabin was nearly full, a low hum of conversation blending with the steady drone of the engines. Suddenly, a child's piercing cry shattered the calm. From row 14, a little boy sobbed, his face flushed. Farah was about to step in when a deep, steady voice spoke first. "Hey, little guy, want to watch the clouds with me?" The boy sniffled, wide, teary eyes shifting toward the speaker. The man beside him leaned slightly toward the window, his voice smooth, unrushed. Farah hesitated. The man was striking in a way that was almost unfair. Seated by the window, his broad shoulders filled out a perfectly tailored gray suit. Dark brown hair fell slightly over his forehead in a way that felt both natural and deliberate. When he turned, his slate gray eyes caught hers for a fleeting second, sending an unexpected warmth through her. The crying ceased, replaced by quiet curiosity as the boy followed the man's gesture toward the window. He spoke with a patience that stole Farah's breath, describing cloud formations with the ease of someone who had all the time in the world. Her heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of man she had always dreamed of, the father she envisioned for her future children. When the child's mother returned from the restroom, she smiled gratefully, thanking him. Farah stepped closer, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. "You're really great with kids." The man looked up at her, a slow smirk curving his lips. "He's not my son." His voice was a low rumble, rich and deep. His mom just stepped away for a moment. Heat crept up Farah's neck as realization hit her. But what unnerved her more was the way his gaze lingered on hers. Too long, too knowing, as if he had seen something in her that she hadn't meant to reveal. She quickly turned away, forcing herself to focus on her duties, but throughout the flight she could still feel his gaze tracing her every move down the aisle. When they landed in Paris, the man stood, adjusting his suit before stepping toward her. He handed her a sleek black card, the gold lettering gleaming under the cabin lights. "Call me," he said, his voice firm, more of a command than a request. Before she could respond, he had disappeared into the flow of disembarking passengers. Farah looked down at the card. Charlie Hayes. The name lingered in her mind like a whispered temptation. She had no idea that this card would change her life forever. The black business card remained in Farah's pocket for weeks, a small secret she often touched as if, by running her fingers over it, she could still feel the warmth of the man who had given it to her. Charlie Hayes. His name lingered in her mind, pulling her back to the memory of those piercing gray eyes, cold yet mesmerizing. She had hesitated. A part of her wanted to forget that fleeting moment, to dismiss the thought of this dangerous man. But every time she stood inside a plane, Surrounded by unfamiliar faces and the monotony of routine, she found herself remembering him. The quiet confidence, the effortless charm, the way he had looked at her like he already knew her secrets. For weeks she had told herself she wouldn't call, that she shouldn't. But every time she reached into her pocket and felt the sleek edges of that black card, temptation whispered louder. What was one call? One conversation? And so, that evening in Milan, hands trembling slightly, Farah did something she never thought she'd be bold enough to do. She called him. Her pulse pounded as the line rang, and when his deep, familiar voice came through, she nearly lost her breath. "I was wondering when you'd call." There was a hint of amusement in his tone, as if he had known all along that she wouldn't be able to resist. "I just wanted to say hello," she tried to keep her voice steady. He chuckled softly, the sound washing over her like a slow wave. "Just hello, have dinner with me tonight." Farah hesitated, but before she could overthink, she heard herself say, "All right." That evening, she slipped into a deep red dress, one that hugged her curves in ways she rarely allowed. When she stepped into the Ritz Paris, Charlie's gray eyes locked onto her, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than he cared to admit. Dinner was a blur of laughter, stolen glances, and conversations that pulled her in deeper than she intended. Every time he leaned closer, his voice rich and low, it felt like she was being drawn into a world she had never dared to explore. When the meal ended, Charlie tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Come up to my suite for a drink?" She knew she should say no. They had only just reconnected after a few fleeting hours, but the storm inside her was raging, a fire she had never felt before. Farah swallowed hard, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Okay." And so she stepped into the elevator with him, unaware that she had just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The elevator ascended to the top floor of the Ritz Paris in a silence so thick it pressed against Farah's skin. The only sound she could hear was the frantic beat of her own heart, mingling with Charlie's steady, measured breaths beside her. The doors slid open. His hand came to rest lightly on the small of her back. A barely there touch, yet it sent a shiver rippling through her. His suite was opulent. Warm golden lighting, cream-colored walls adorned with delicate gold accents, and a chandelier casting soft reflections across the room. But Farah didn't care about the luxury. All she could focus on was Charlie. His presence overwhelming, inescapable. The door clicked shut behind them. There was no turning back. Charlie walked to the bar, pouring amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses. He handed one to her, his gaze never straying from her face. "Brandy, not too strong." His voice was smooth, low. Farah accepted the glass, but didn't drink. She couldn't. Charlie set his own glass down, then closed the distance between them. Without a word, he tilted her chin up with 2 fingers, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're trembling, huh?" His voice was quiet, yet it carried an unspoken challenge. Farah swallowed hard. But before she could finish, his lips brushed against hers. The kiss wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, possessive, like he was savoring the way she fit against him. When he pulled away, his gray eyes were darker, a slow, knowing smirk curving his lips. "First time?" Farah froze. She didn't need to ask what he meant. Her silence was answer enough. Charlie took a step back, his expression shifting. There was surprise in his eyes, but something else too, something deeper, a flicker of possession. "Farah?" His voice was rougher now. Her cheeks burned as she bit her lip. "I've never done this before." Charlie stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. A dark, dangerous smile. "Then let me show you how." He kissed her again. But this time, there was nothing slow about it. This time, the fire had been unleashed. Morning light spilled softly through the sheer curtains of the Parisian suite, bathing the room in gold. Farah stirred awake, reaching instinctively for the warmth beside her, only to find nothing but empty sheets. The bed was cold. Charlie was gone. She sat up, pulling the white sheets around her, her eyes scanning the room, searching for any trace of the night before. And then she saw it. a sleek black business card resting neatly on the bedside table, next to a folded note in crisp, elegant handwriting. "I had an early meeting, but this won't be the last time." Farah reached for the card, her fingers trembling slightly. A strange sensation swelled in her chest. Not quite regret, not quite anxiety, but an undeniable sense of anticipation. From that night on, she was no longer standing on the edge. She had stepped into Charlie Hayes' world. Their encounters after that came fast and burned hotter than she ever imagined. Paris, Rome, Dubai, wherever Farah landed, Charlie was always there. In lavish hotels, aboard his private jet, they collided like two forces that could not resist each other. Their nights were a blur of tangled sheets, whispered confessions, and desperate touches that made the space between them disappear. But then the sun would rise, and she would have to leave again. Each time she stood at the hotel door, suitcase in hand, Charlie would pull her close, his voice low, edged with something almost raw. "Stay with me a little longer." She could only kiss him, slow, lingering, as if it could somehow freeze time. But no matter how long she stretched that moment, it would still come to an end, and the door would close behind her, leaving him standing there alone. Charlie never asked her to give up her life, her career, but Farah knew that each time she walked away, his patience thinned. She could see it in his eyes, in the way his grip on her waist tightened just a little more every time they parted. Something was changing. A storm was brewing, and soon it would consume them both. Chicago, a cold winter night. Farah stepped into the hotel, the thick coat around her shoulders doing little to hide the exhaustion weighing down her steps. Her flight had been delayed, and out of habit, she had called Charlie. He didn't hesitate. He simply said, "I'll be waiting." When she unlocked the suite door, he was already there, leaning against the bedpost, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gray eyes darkening the moment they landed on her. Farah dropped her bag, taking a slow breath. Before she could say a word, Charlie pulled her into him, his lips crushing against hers, stealing her breath in a way only he could. They fell into each other like always, desperate, hungry, making up for every moment apart. But when the heat faded, when she lay against his chest, Charlie spoke. "Stay with me." Farah let out a soft laugh, tracing lazy patterns on his bare skin. "You know I can't." Charlie sat up abruptly, his gaze sharper than before. "Why not? You always have a choice." She opened her mouth, but he kept going, his voice tight with frustration. "You always leave, Farah. You always walk away." For the first time, she heard something raw in his voice, a vulnerability he had never let slip. She swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but Charlie pulled her closer, his eyes burning with intensity. "I don't want to be just a stop along your journey." Her heart clenched. "Charlie?" But he didn't let her finish. Charlie ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply as if trying to steady himself. His jaw tightened, his usual controlled demeanor cracking just slightly. Then, as if coming to a final decision, he pushed off the bed, crossing the room to where his coat lay draped over a chair. From its pocket, he pulled out a small black velvet box. When he turned back to her, his gray eyes locked onto hers, uncharacteristically vulnerable. And then, he flipped open the lid. The diamond glinted under the soft glow of the hotel lights. "Marry me." Farah's world stilled. She had dreamed of this moment her whole life, but never had she imagined it would come from someone like Charlie, a storm she could never contain. Tears welled in her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." Charlie smiled. For the first time, it wasn't a smirk of challenge or possession. For the first time, it was pure relief. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her deep, as if sealing this moment into eternity. A few weeks later, Farah Carter was no longer a flight attendant. The sky had taken her across the world, but at last she had found a place to land. Their wedding took place on the Amalfi Coast, Italy, where the sunset bathed the sea in gold, where the ocean breeze carried the scent of freedom and love. Charlie stood there, dressed in a sleek black suit, his gray eyes never leaving her as she walked toward him in a gown as pure as the promise they were about to make. He had once been a man who didn't believe in love, but Farah had changed everything. When the officiant asked the final question, Charlie didn't wait even a second. "I do." Farah looked into his eyes, her heart overflowing, and when she whispered, "I do," in return, her voice trembled. Not from fear, but from a happiness too vast to contain. They kissed beneath the Italian sky, in front of friends and family, but in truth, there were only the two of them in that moment. Charlie, the man who once thought love was just another transaction, now stood before her, offering something he had never given anyone: his forever. From that day on, Farah only flew one journey, the one beside him. Charlie Hayes could have had anything, but in the end, he only ever wanted one thing: Farah Carter, the woman who turned a skeptic into a dreamer. And from that moment on, they never had to say goodbye again. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Amalfi Coast in soft hues of orange and purple. Farah stood on the villa's balcony, her brown eyes reflecting the shimmering waves as the salty breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the garden behind her. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind. Lost in thought again? Charlie's deep voice rumbled against her ear, warm and familiar. Farah smiled, leaning into his embrace. "No, just thinking about how everything changed." Charlie chuckled, pressing a soft kiss to her hair. "And do you regret it?" She turned to face him, her eyes shining. Not for a second. His fingers tilted her chin up, his slate gray eyes locking onto hers, holding her captive in this moment. "Good, because I'm never letting you go again." Their lips met under the golden twilight, the rhythmic lull of the waves their only witness. Farah had spent her life flying from one place to another, never truly belonging anywhere. But now she had finally found home. And for the first time, she no longer felt lost among the skies. Charlie was the only sky she would ever need.